Welcome everyone to today's talk by Kathleen Fitzpatrick entitled Working in Public, Generosity and the Knowledge Commons, which is part of UBC Library's Open Scholarship in Practice Week. I'm Mary Chapman. I'm Academic Director of the UBC Vancouver's Public Humanities Hub and co-host of today's event. When the UBC Library approached the Public Humanities Hub about potentially co-sponsoring a talk by Professor Fitzpatrick, I jumped at the chance. The Hub was founded in early 2019 at about the same time that Professor Fitzpatrick's book, Generous Thinking, A Radical Approach to Saving the University, was released. And I have been inspired by her work ever since. Thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that many of us, the Hub staff, the library staff, did much of the work to assemble this event while we were working on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam, on which UBC is privileged to be located. This is land on which Musqueam people have generously taught and learned for centuries. Although we're now assembled virtually in different places around the Lower Mainland and beyond, we invite you to think about the hospitality of Indigenous groups on whose territories you are privileged to live and work. Thank you. I want to pass the mic now to Susan Parker, University Librarian, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks to all of you who are here. Kathleen Fitzpatrick is Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. Prior to assuming this role in 2017, she served as Associate Executive Director and Director of Scholarly Communication of the Modern Language Association. She was Managing Editor there of PMLA and other MLA publications. She's also held appointments as Visiting Research Professor of English at NYU and Visiting Professor of Media at Coventry University. Before joining the MLA staff in 2011, she was Professor of Media Studies at Pomona College, where she had been a member of the faculty since 1998. She is the author of Generous Thinking, A Radical Approach to Saving the University, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, as mentioned in February 2019. She is also author of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, published by NYU Press in November 2011 and released for open peer review in fall 2019. Additionally, she is the author of The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American Novel in the Age of Television, published in 2006 by Vanderbilt University Press. As a librarian, I must point out that the latter two books have been recognized as outstanding academic titles by Choice magazine. The recipient of numerous NEH and Mellon grants, Kathleen is Project Director of Humanities Commons, which is an open access, open source network serving nearly 25,000 scholars and practitioners in the humanities. She is also co-founder of the digital scholarly network Media Commons, where she led a number of experiments in open peer review and other innovations in scholarly publishing. Kathleen is a member of the editorial or advisory boards of publications and projects that include the Open Library of the Humanities, Luminos, the Open Annotation Collaboration, Press Forward, and Thresholds. She currently serves on the boards of directors of the Council on Library and Information Resources, or CLIR, and the Educopia Institute. Kathleen is a scholar who practices generosity in sharing much of her work in openly accessible forms, and by engaging with the scholarly community and beyond in talks very much like this one. This embodies her principle, I think, of working in public. Kathleen is currently working on a project entitled Leading Generously, which is a follow-up to Generous Thinking. It's designed as one answer to the question, yes, okay, but how do we start? I hope she'll tell us a little bit about this along with other thoughts she has to share with us today, and I hope she will lead us into a great conversation about community engagement in institutional change. Some of you may have attended Kathleen's Monroe lecture in 2019 at SFU, co-sponsored by the UBC iSchool. So I hope if you have, you're returning for more. And on behalf of UBC Library, the Public Humanities Conference, Public Humanities Hub, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Kathleen Fitzgerald, to UBC today. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to get to be here. So I'll begin. Thank you. I would like also to begin acknowledging that I am in my home, very near the Michigan State University campus. That I want to acknowledge that MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land that was ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So thank you. And I want, before I begin, to thank Mary and Susan for this introduction and for inviting me to be part of the Open Scholarship and Practice Week. And I also wanted to thank the rest of the team, Leonora and Heather and Eka, for all their support. I'm delighted to have this chance to talk a little bit about the kinds of work and the kinds of futures that making scholarly work more open could make possible. So. Part of what I hope to address today stems from my recent book, Generous Thinking. The book as a whole argues that the future of the university, as we've known it, depends heavily on rebuilding relationships of trust between our institutions and the publics that they serve. The book addresses lots of aspects of these relationships and ways they might be fostered, but the key bit for today is that the networks and spaces that support digital scholarship are really crucial to building and maintaining connections with a range of broader publics in the context of the work that we do on campus. So a bit of background. I come to this work through a slightly idiosyncratic path. Back in 2002, I had just finished the long process of revising my dissertation into my first book, and I was feeling stifled. Years of work were stuck on my hard disk, and there seemed the very real possibility that no one might ever read it other than me. I wasn't entirely wrong about that. It took another 4 years after that to get the things published for a whole lot of complicated reasons. But during this moment in 2002, I stumbled across the blog of a friend from grad school. I mean, this is at the first efflorescence of blogging. And this thing was funny and it was erudite and it had an audience and people were reading it. And I knew they were reading it because they left comments responding to and interacting with them. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So my own blog, which I started out of the baldest desire to get someone somewhere to read something I wrote, wound up doing something more interesting than I expected. It helped me build a small community. I found another of other early academic bloggers, all of whom were involved in ongoing comment and cross-link conversations. And those relationships, which opened out into a growing network of scholars working online, were crucial to me as a somewhat isolated assistant professor. I mean, I had struggled to make the intellectual and professional connections that might help my writing develop, and it was the blog that really provided the first opportunity for me. Even more, the posts that I published there were the first pieces of my writing to be cited in more formal academic settings. So fast forward to the moment in 2009 when I just finished the draft of my second book. Rather than simply have the manuscript sent out for anonymous peer review, I asked my press to let me post the draft online for open comment too. Now, I get asked a lot about how I made that decision, and in particular, how I worked up the courage to release something unfinished into the world where anybody could have said anything about it. Now, the truth of the matter is that the risks didn't figure into my thinking. What I knew was that there were a lot of folks out there in many different fields and in lots of different kinds of jobs. with whom I'd had productive, engaging interactions that had contributed to the book's development to that point. And I really wanted to hear their thoughts about where I'd wound up. I trusted them to help me, and they did, overwhelmingly so. Now, it's important to acknowledge, first of all, the entire boatload of privilege that not thinking about the risks requires. I mean, I was writing from a sufficiently safe position that allowing flaws in my work in progress to be publicly visible wasn't a real threat. It's also not incidental that this was 2009, right? A much more naive hour in the age of the internet. The events of the last few years, from Gamergate through the 2016 presidential campaign and on into the one that we are hopefully wrapping up today, have made the risks of opening one's work up online all too palpable. But my experiences with the blog, with the book manuscript, and with other projects that I had opened to online discussion still leave me convinced that there's a community, real or potential, that's interested in the kind of work that I care about, willing to engage with and support that work's development. And perhaps most importantly today, willing to work on building and sustaining the connections that make up the community itself. So I tested that belief in 2018 by opening the draft of Generous Thinking to a similar kind of open review. Between early February and the end of March, I staged a process in which I first invited a group of readers to spend 2 weeks reading and commenting on the manuscript, after which I opened the project to the world for discussion. In the end, 30 commenters left a total of 354 comments and prompted 56 responses of my own, giving me a really rich view of the revision process that lay ahead. Now, I'm not going to say that it was all rainbows and unicorns. I mean, there are a few comments that came up in this process that sting, and there are a few spots where I wish the evident gaps in my thinking had been maybe a little less visible. But I'm convinced that the book is much better for having gone through this in-depth public process. So what I'm focused on in my work then is the ways that networks that support digital scholarship can enable scholars to build new kinds of communities like this one, right? Within our fields, with scholars in different fields, and with folks off campus who care about the kinds of work that we do. By finding ways to connect with readers and writers beyond our usual circles of experts in a range of different registers and in ways that allow for meaningful multi-directional exchange, we can create the possibilities for far more substantial public participation in and engagement with the work that's being done on campus, in the humanities and in the academy more broadly. And we can build programs and networks and platforms that don't just bring the university to the world, but that also involve the world in the university. Now, there are, of course, some real obstacles that have to be faced in this process. Some of them reflect the communication platforms that we use today, and blogs don't readily produce the same level of engagement that they did in the early 2000s, in part because of their massive proliferation, and in part because of the dispersal of online conversations onto Twitter and Facebook and other networks. And as a result, online communities of readers and writers are unlikely to develop spontaneously. Instead, building community around online work has to be far more deliberate, reaching out to potential readers and participants and finding ways to draw them and ourselves back into sustained online conversation. And of course, the nature of internet discourse has changed in recent years as much as has its location. I mean, trolls are not a new phenomenon by any means, but they certainly seem to have multiplied, and the damage that they can inflict has escalated. Taking one's work public can involve significant risk, especially where that work involves questions of social justice that are under attack by malevolent groups online, and especially for already marginalized and underrepresented members of the academic community who open up engagement with an often hostile world. Now, I don't have any easy answers to these problems. I don't have a perfect platform to offer, and I don't know how to fix the malignant aspects of human behavior. Countering these destructive forces really requires advanced preparation and focused responses. And ensuring that public discourse about scholarly work remains productive requires a tremendous amount of collective labor and the careful development and maintenance of trust in order to create inclusive online communities that can be open to and yet safe in the world. But there are several other challenges beyond these that I want to explore today. Challenges that are really about the ways that we as scholars do our work, the ways that we can draw a range of broader publics to that work, and the ways that we can ensure that the work that we do together is supported in an ongoing way. Now, the first of these is the need to ensure that the work that we do can be discovered and accessed by any interested reader, and not just those readers who have ready entry to well-funded research libraries. And it should go without saying that it's impossible for anyone to care about what we do if they can't see it. And yet, perhaps because we assume we're mostly writing for one another, the results of our work often end up in places where it can't be found, and even if it can be found, where it can't be accessed by members of the broader public. Now, the second challenge lies in ensuring that the work is accessible in a very different sense, right? Not just allowing readers to get their hands on it, but enabling them to see in it the things that they might care about. We often resent the ways that academic work gets dumbed down when it's reported on in public venues. But we might think instead about ways that we can productively mainstream our arguments, engaging readers where they are, rather than always forcing them to come find us in our venues and on our terms. Beyond access and accessibility, however, if we hope to engage the public with our work, we need to ensure that it's open in the broadest possible sense, open to response, to participation, to new kinds of cultural creation by more kinds of public thinkers. In other words, we need to focus not just on the public's potential consumption of the work that's done by the university, but also about potential modes of co-production that involve communities in the work of the university. Such collaborations might serve as a style of work that our universities can fruitfully model for the rest of our culture, new modes of scholarship done not just for, but with the world. So networks for digital scholarship have the potential to create the conditions for greater access, for greater accessibility, and for greater public participation in the work that we all do as scholars. And by by encouraging this kind of work, I don't mean to suggest that there's no room for more traditional modes of internal exchange among field-based experts, right? There is room for that, and there always should be. But the 21st century university must provide means by which the results of those expert-to-expert exchanges can become part of the larger cultural conversations that are taking place around us. Our work doesn't have to address or engage everyone at all times, but different aspects of our work might engage with different audiences at different moments. And knowing how to think about those audiences, indeed, to think about them not just as audiences, but as potential interlocutors, is a crucial skill for today's scholars, and a skill that needs to be cultivated and supported. Now, the simplest way of making more scholarly work more available to the public is by making that work available through open access venues. There's a long history to the open access movement, of course, and in the book, I dig into that history and the ties the movement created between its more altruistic goals, establishing and supporting a globally equitable mode of distributing knowledge, and its more pragmatic arguments about the impact that public access might have on the advancement of research. I mean, the key point in that relationship is that what's good for the public turns out to be good for scholarship too. So if we publish in ways that enable any interested reader to access our work, that work will be more read, more cited, creating more impact for us in our fields. Making our work more openly accessible enables scholars in areas of the world without extensive library budgets, as well as North American-based instructors and students at undergraduate teaching institutions and secondary schools to use it. Making our work openly available also allows it to reach other interested readers from across the increasingly broad humanities workforce who may not have access to research libraries. And all of this can produce an expansion in our readership and an expansion in our influence, which is an unmitigatedly good thing. And yet, it's clear that we often resist opening our work to broader publics for a variety of reasons. Many of us keep our work restricted to our own discourse communities because we fear the consequences of making it available to broader publics, and not without justification. The public often seems determined to misunderstand us, to interpret what we say with focused hostility or nearly as bad utter dismissiveness. But because the subject matter of much of the humanities and the social sciences in particular seems as though it should be accessible, our determination to wrestle with difficult or highly politicized questions and our use of expert methods or vocabularies can feel threatening to many readers. They fail to understand us. We take their failure to understand as an insult. Admittedly, sometimes it is, but not always, right? Given this failure to communicate, we see no harm in keeping our work closed off from the public, arguing that we're really only writing for a small group of specialists anyhow. So why would public access matter? Well, it matters because the more we close our work away from the public and the more we turn away from dialogue across the boundaries of the academy, the more we undermine the public's willingness to support our research and our institutions. As numerous public humanities scholars, including Kathleen Woodward, have argued, the major crisis facing the funding of higher education in the United States today is an increasingly widespread conviction that education is a private responsibility rather than a public good. And we end up strengthening that conviction and worsening the crisis when we treat our work as private. Closing our work away from non-scholarly readers might protect us from certain kinds of public criticism, but it can't protect us from public apathy, which is a condition that may be far more dangerous in the current economic and political environment. The risks are real, especially for scholars working in politically engaged fields, but only through dialogue that moves outside our own discourse communities will we have any chance of convincing the broader public, including our governments, of the relevance of what we do on campus. And of course, engaging readers in thoughtful discussions about the important issues we study lies at the core of the academic mission. I mean, it's at the heart of our values. We don't create knowledge in order to hoard it, but instead, every day in the classroom, in the lecture hall, in our writing, we embrace an ethic of generosity, of paying forward knowledge that we have received as a gift. We teach as we were taught. We publish as we learn from the publications of others. We can't pay back those who came before us, but we can and do give to those who come after. Our participation in an ethical, voluntary scholarly community is grounded in the obligations that we hold for one another, obligations that derive from the generosity that we've received. Okay. Idealistic, right? And that kind of idealism is all well and good, but it doesn't adequately account for an academic universe in which we are evaluated based on individual achievement and in which prestige often overrides all other values. I dig into the institutional responsibility for and the effects of that bias toward prestige in another part of the larger project. But here, I want to think a bit about its effects on the individual scholar, and also on that scholar's role in perpetuating this hierarchical status quo. Surveys of faculty publishing practices indicate that scholars choose to publish in venues that are perceived to have the greatest influence on their peers. And that influence is often understood to increase with exclusivity, right? The more difficult it is to get an article into a journal, the higher the perceived value of having done so. But this reasoning too easily shades over into a sense that the more exclusive a publication's audience, the higher its value. And this, at its most benign, is self-defeating, right? If we privilege exclusivity above all else, we wind up undermining our work's potential cultural impact. As my friend David Perry has commented, knowledge that is not public is not knowledge, right? It's only in giving it away, in making it as publicly available as possible, that we produce knowledge. As it is, most of the players involved in the production of scholarship have always been engaged in a process of giving it away. Authors, reviewers, scholarly editors, and others involved in the process have long offered their work to others without requiring direct compensation. The question is how we offer that work, though, and to whom. In fact, the entire system of scholarly communication runs on an engine of generosity, one that demonstrates the ways that private enterprise can never adequately provide for the public good. So rather than committing our work to private channels, right, signing it over to corporate publishers that profit at higher education's expense, how might all of the members of the university community, researchers, instructors, libraries, presses, and administrations, instead work to develop and support a system that's based on our highest values? I mean, what if we understood sustainability in scholarly communication not as the ability to generate revenue, but instead the ability to keep the engine of generosity running? Now, it's important to distinguish between this call to generosity and the injunction to work for free, produced by the devaluing of so much intellectual and professional labor within the so-called information economy. A mode of forced volunteerism has spread throughout contemporary culture, compelling college students and recent graduates to take on unpaid internships in order to get a foot in the door, compelling creative professionals to do free work in order to build exposure, thereby restricting opportunity to those who can already afford to seek it. And of course, there are too many academic equivalents, right? Vastly underpaid adjunct instructors, overworked graduate assistants, an ever-growing list of mentoring and other service requirements that fall disproportionately on the shoulders of junior faculty, women faculty, and faculty of color. Labor, in fact, is the primary reason that we can't just simply make all scholarly publications available for free online. And while the scholarship might be provided without charge, the authors have by and large been paid by their employers or by their granting organizations and will be compensated with a publication credit or line on a CV, a positive annual review outcome. Reviewers are rarely paid, almost never by journals and very modestly by book publishers, but they receive insight into developing work and the ability to shape their fields and support their communities by way of compensation. But there's a vast range of other labor that's necessary for the production of publications, even when distributed online, right? Managing submissions, communicating with authors, copy editing, proofreading, website design and maintenance, and so on. We need to understand that labor as professional too, and compensate it accordingly. So where I'm asking for generosity, for giving it away, is from those who are fully credited and compensated, those tenured and tenure-track faculty and other fully employed members of our professions who can and should contribute to the world the products of the labor that they've already been supported in undertaking. Similarly, generosity is called for from those institutions that can and should underwrite the production of scholarship on behalf of the academy and the public at large. And it's our mission and our responsibility to look beyond our own walls to the world beyond, to enlarge the gifts that we've received by making them public. Doing so requires that we hold the potential for public engagement with our work among our highest values, that we understand such potential engagement as a public good that we can share in creating. But there are steps beyond simply making work publicly available. Critics of open access often argue that the public couldn't possibly be interested in scholarly work, right? They can't understand it, so they don't need access to it. Now, though I would insist that the critics are wrong in that conclusion, they may not be entirely wrong in the premise. Our work doesn't often communicate well to general readers. And that's fine, again, at least to an extent. Communication within a discourse community plays a crucial role in that community's development. And there must always be room for expert to expert communication of a highly specialized nature. But that inwardly focused sharing of work has been privileged to our detriment, right? Scholars are often not rewarded, and in fact are at times actively punished for publishing in popular venues. And because the values that are instantiated by our reward systems have a profound effect on the ways that we train our students, we end up building the wall between academic and public discourse higher and higher with every passing cohort. Now, of course, many scholars have recently pushed against this trend by developing public-facing publications that bring the ideas of humanities scholars to greater public attention. Venues like the Los Angeles Review of Books and Public Books, among many others. There are also a host of other kinds of digital projects that demonstrate the ways that many scholars are already working in multiple registers, engaging with multiple audiences. These venues open scholarly concerns and conversations to a broader readership and demonstrate the public value of scholarly approaches to understanding contemporary culture. But if we are to open our ideas to larger public audiences, we need to give some serious thought to the mode and the voice of our writing. Because mainstream readers often don't understand our prose, they're able to assume, sometimes dismissively, sometimes defensively, that the ideas that it contains are overblown and unimportant. And this concern about academic writing isn't restricted to anti-intellectual critics, right? Editors at many mainstream publications have noted the challenges that they face in getting scholarly authors to address broader audiences in the ways that their venues require. Now, we've been trained to focus on complexity and nuance, and the result is often lines of argumentation and lines of prose that are far from straightforward. Getting past the accusations of obscurity and irrelevance requires us to open up our rhetoric, to demonstrate to a generally educated reader how and why what we do matters. Again, not all academic writing needs to be done in a public register, but we would benefit from doing more work in ways that are not just technically, but also rhetorically accessible to the public. And we're all already called to varying extents to participate in that kind of rhetorical register. Our work in the classroom, for instance, demonstrates that translating difficult concepts and their expression for non-expert readers is central to our profession. This act of translation is an ongoing project that we might take on more broadly, getting the public invested and involved in the work that's taking place on campus, and thereby building support for that work. But for that project to be successful, scholars have to be prepared to bridge the communication gaps by honing our ability to alternate speaking with one another and speaking with different audiences. So we need to think a little bit about what it is we might need to learn in order to do that kind of work. Public-facing writing, as many editors of mainstream intellectual publications would note, is very different from academic writing. And by and large, it's not something that we've been trained to do. But numerous initiatives are working today to help scholarly authors focus and express the ideas contained in their scholarly publications in ways that help broader audiences engage with them. And ideally, this kind of writing should become part of graduate training across the university. However, a key component of the work of the public intellectual is not simply addressing, but actually helping to build that public in the first place. Nancy Fraser long ago noted the fragmentation of contemporary public life into a plurality of competing counterpublics. And we need to consider that in the possibility that in retreating from direct engagement with the public, scholars have actually contributed to the public's fragmentation. As Alan Jacobs has noted, subaltern counterpublics are essential for those who have never had seats at the table of power, but they can also be immensely appealing to those who feel that their public presence and authority have waned. And this kind of retreat of scholars into private intellectual life has produced a tighter sense of community for us and a kind of comfort in feeling understood, but at the cost of withdrawing scholarly issues and perspectives from public view, and with the result, again, of further fragmentation of the public itself. So if we're to return to public discourse, if we're to connect with and perhaps even be responsible for creating a range of broader publics, we're going to have to contend with those publics' multiplicity, even as we draw them together into dialogue. Most importantly, perhaps, we need to recognize that scholars who work in public modes are doing work that is not just public, but also intellectual. Our processes of evaluation and assessment too often shove things that don't meet a relatively narrow set of criteria for research into the category of service. As a result, when scholars make the transition to more public prose, their work is frequently under-rewarded, if not actively derided back on campus. Writing for the public is often assumed to be less developed, when in fact it's likely to have been more stringently edited than most scholarly publications. And worse yet, the academic universe too often assumes that a scholar who writes for a public market has had to dumb down key ideas in order to do so. So if we're going to make publicly engaged digital scholarship genuinely sustainable, we have to ensure that it's properly respected and properly rewarded so that the focus can genuinely be placed on engaging with the communities the work is trying to reach. And this is in some ways the heart of the problem, right? We often don't know how to reach those publics because we don't fully understand them. And as I argue at length in the larger project, this is in no small part because we often spend a bit too much time talking and not enough time listening to them. We need to make room for the public in our arguments and in our prose, but we also need to understand those arguments and that prose as one part of a larger multi-voiced conversation. And this is the key, right? Having found a way to connect with a broader audience, having helped to transform that audience into something like a public, how do we then activate that public to do work on its own behalf? And here is where our working in public, creating public access, valuing public engagement, becoming public intellectuals, transforms into the creation of a genuinely public scholarship. A scholarship that's not simply performed for the public, but that includes and is in fact given over to the publics with whom we work. In public scholarship, members of our chosen communities enter into our projects not just as readers, but as participants, as stakeholders. Recent experiments in citizen science provide some potentially interesting examples. One might see projects like Galaxy Zoo that go beyond crowdsourcing online, instead enlisting networked participants, not just in mass repetitive tasks, but in the actual process of discovery. But what might the citizen humanities look like? Well, it might look like museum exhibits, such as Pacific Worlds at the Oakland Museum of California, which engaged members of local Pacific communities in the planning and development processes. It might look like the September 11th Digital Archive, developed by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University and the American Social History Project, which presents first-hand accounts of the events of that day and other archival materials from more than 150,000 participants. It might look like the Baltimore Stories Project at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which used humanities scholarship as a convening force to bring community organizers, educators, and nonprofit organizations together to explore narratives of race in American life. What all of these projects have in common is that each of them explores a cultural concern of compelling interest to the public that the project engages, precisely because that concern belongs to them, right? The work involved is not theirs just to learn from, but to shape and define as well. And engaging these publics and working with scholars to interpret, understand, and teach their cultures and histories can connect them to the projects of the university in ways that might help encourage a deeper understanding of and support for what it is that the university does and why. By working in publicly engaged ways, and by bringing those publics into the self-reflexive modes of humanities and social science-based critique, we have the potential to produce a renewed conception of how intellectual life operates in contemporary culture. But that renewed conception is going to require us to be open to a new understanding of the notion of our peers. Open public scholarship might lead us to understand the peer not just as a pre-existing credential, right? But instead as a status that emerges through participation in the processes of a community of practice. And changing this definition of the peer has a profound set of consequences, not just for determining whom we address under that label, but also who considers themselves to be part of that category. Opening the idea of what it is to be an intellectual or what it is to be a peer to a much broader range of forms of critical inquiry and active project participation has the potential to reshape relations between town and gown, to lay the groundwork for more productive conversations across the borders of the campus, and to create an understanding of the extent to which the work of the academy matters for our culture as a whole. And much of that work begins with establishing the kinds of networks through which new forms of collaborative public scholarship can be realized. New institutional structures might enable us to ask what would be possible if we were able to open up our scholarly practices to real public engagement, to deep interdisciplinarity, to new modes of working. How can new networks enable public universities like mine and yours to more genuinely focus on the mission of bringing knowledge to the people of the area that we serve? How might such a network draw public support back to the institution by demonstrating the extent to which the work that we do is intended for, in dialogue with, and in service of the public? For public universities to win back public support, they must find ways like this, really structurally, strategically, at the heart not just of their mission statement, but of their actual mission, to place publicly engaged work at the top of its priorities. And that starts with conversations like this, where scholars can come together to explore new work in and with the public. So thank you very much for coming today, and I'll look forward to hearing any of your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Susan and I are encouraging you to members of the audience to put questions in the Q&A box. We'll give you a little bit of time to do that while we ask our questions. So Susan, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Mary. Kathleen, one of the things that kind of stopped me, it's on page 34 of your book, it stopped me in a great way. I'll read this quote. You say, "Yes is the beginning of yes and, through which we create the possibility of working together to build something entirely new." And I loved that because it actually reminds me of the outlines that Tina Fey has made for how improv works.
Exactly.
Which, as you know, starts with participants saying yes and it sounds like that resonates with you, but could you talk a little bit about what yes and means?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this, I will confess, comes directly out of Tina Fey by way of a blog post written by my friend and colleague Lisa Rohde, who was thinking about the implications of Fey's model of yes and in improv and what it can do for academic life, and particularly for digital scholars. And one of the things that Fey says about yes and is that if you're in this moment of improv on stage and somebody says, hey, I've got a gun, and you say, no, you don't, it's a banana. you've completely stopped whatever it was that was developing in this moment, in this scene. But if instead you accept the premise that's been brought to you and then add to it with that yes and, you have the potential to do something really astonishing. And this is something that it seems to me we could learn from in public discourse in general. But I also think that we could learn a whole lot from in the academic universe. We have a tendency to believe in this sort of subterranean way that we aren't fully conscious of. Because it's been ingrained in us since graduate school, that the way that we distinguish ourselves in a particular kind of academic discussion is to take an idea that's been brought to the table and say, oh, you know, this part of it is completely wrong, and my idea is the one that we need to pay attention to. And if instead we as scholars were able to listen a little bit more deeply and to start with that yes and moment, we could really more fully build on one another's ideas and develop them into something radically new, rather than finding ourselves in this ongoing butting of heads over, you know, which side of a particular argument is correct. So that's how I hope that we might find ourselves in a more generous space in the ways that we talk to one another, in the ways that we hear the ideas that are being presented to us.
That's great, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, my turn. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about how institutions like the Public Humanities Hub, the Knowledge Exchange, the Research Commons at UBC, all of which have been created fairly recently to encourage more public-facing scholarship. I'm wondering if you could help us think through what kinds of supports we can offer to scholars, particularly the scholars that you mentioned who experience the risks of doing public scholarship, either because of their topic or identities or context.
Well, the first thing that I would say is that scholars who are working in public who face those kinds of risks, as you say, they can come from the subject matter of the work, they can come from the identity of the scholar, either of which can be under attack. Frequently, it's both. Those scholars need, first and foremost, to know that their institution and that the individuals that they work with within their institution have their back, right? That they're going to be supported by the institution and by its administration and by the structures around them should an attack come from a malevolent group, right? And they also need to know that they've got colleagues who can help them through that moment. I mean, that it's a really difficult experience for an individual scholar to suddenly be getting hate mail and potentially even as much as death threats from anonymous folks out there. So knowing that there are people to whom that scholar can turn to say, should this ever happen to either of us, I will take over your social media for a time and make sure that, you know, everything is being scanned and sent to the proper authorities. Similarly, if it happens to you, I will do the same for you, right? That just to make sure that there is a community that's there and prepared and ready to respond. So I think that one of the things that something like the Public Humanities Hub could do is to offer support in such moments, and to be willing to be that force who will talk to the dean or talk to the provost or whoever it is that needs to know that this scholar is doing serious work and needs support from the institution now. That's one thing. There are other forms of support that are crucial as well. And some of it comes in the form of training, helping scholars prepare to talk with different kinds of publics, helping scholars find and work with, navigate what it is to do community-oriented scholarship. This is not something that most of us learned in grad school, right? And so finding ways to help help develop that skill set from in current grad students, but also in quite senior scholars at this point, is a really significant service that groups like the ones that you described can provide.
Super. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Questions are starting to come in, so I thought maybe Susan and I would take turns reading them. So Susan, do you want to read the first one in the Q&A?
Sure. Well, I think you actually could have answered this one already about academic training based on an apprenticeship model, which you talked about. How do you speak to graduate students about these issues that you've been discussing, knowing they're under increasing pressure themselves to conform with these traditional metrics of success and prestige if they hope to get an academic career?
They are. And one of the strongest pieces of advice that I attempt to give my graduate students is that they should use the time that they have in graduate school. I mean, obviously to focus on their academic training, on the courses that they're taking, on the writing that they're going to do when they hit the dissertation, on their research, on training themselves to become scholars. But there are all of these other resources that are available on campus beyond their own department that it is crucial, I think, and increasingly crucial for graduate students today to take advantage of. So I love this idea of the apprenticeship model, because I really think that we do our graduate students a disservice by sort of trapping them within our own units and keeping them only teaching our courses and only writing things for us. If we can encourage our graduate students to get some experience working in the library, to get some experience doing an internship with the university press, to get some experience working in a student affairs office, or in all of the many ways that the campus reaches and connects the folks within the community, it becomes possible for graduate students, I think, to imagine other kinds of futures and to think about what they might want to do that could take them beyond the classroom. Or it enables them to develop certain kinds of skills that they can then bring back to the classroom and have different kinds of conversations with their own students going forward. So I think, one of the major reasons for the crisis for particularly PhDs in the humanities, it has been that we have felt like it's a pipeline from, you enter graduate school and then at the other end, you're supposed to end up with this academic career. And many graduate faculty within PhD programs say, well, that's all I know how to train anybody to do. And so there are no other opportunities, it appears, but there are all of these other resources on campus if we knew how to connect our graduate students to them for being able to imagine other kinds of possibilities. So I think the internship model, the apprenticeship model, is a really enormous possibility if we think about it more broadly than just simply apprenticing within the field itself.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Kathleen. I put in the chat a couple of links that I think attendees might be interested in. The first is for the Arts Amplifier program. It's a brand new program run by the Arts Co-op Office for graduate students, and it's making available to them internships and other kinds of community and academic engagement opportunities that will serve them in the ways you've been describing as apprenticeships. I also added in the chat a link to the Humanities Hub's public scholarship training series, which approaches genres of public scholarship, op-eds, documentary film, trade books, things like that. So people may be interested. That's just a shameless plug for the humanities. But now awesome. I'm getting to my question. Someone writes, thank you for your talk. You talk about honing our ability to speak with non-academic audiences and involving the public in the production of scholarship. What ideas do you have on how we might learn to fill this gap?
Oh, this is a big question. There is an entire field of research in community engaged scholarship and ways to go about this. And much as I argue for it, I am not the ideal person to kind of direct you in how to go about this. But the first thing that I would strongly encourage, and this is something that I think a lot of community engaged scholars over the last 20 years have sort of learned the hard way, is that the university has a tendency to sort of parachute into communities and show up ready to help out, right? Here we are, we're from the university, and now we're going to provide our resources to support your endeavors. And it it too frequently begins from an assumption that the university already understands the problem, right? Already knows what it is the public needs and is just ready to kind of dive in and go. And in fact, the process really needs to begin with a much longer, more difficult series of conversations to find out from the public exactly what it is they're interested in, what the needs really are, what the desires really are. There is an example in particular of a digital public history project that was going on somewhere in the Deep South, in which the scholars got a grant and reached out to a historically Black town to say, we've gotten this grant and we're going to come digitize all your town's historical materials. And the folks in the town were like, okay, that's great, but that's not what we need. What we need is training for our students who can to be able to use the technologies that will enable them to access the materials that are being digitized. And so it required the project to take 3 steps back and say, okay, wait, let's stop and sort out what it is we're attempting to accomplish, what you need, and let the project be driven by the community and its concerns, rather than being driven by the scholars who are ready to digitize some stuff. Similarly, I talked a little bit about the Baltimore Stories Project at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. You can imagine what would have happened in a city like Baltimore should it was the Drescher Center for the Humanities that ran this project, if the Drescher Center for the Humanities had put together a lecture series on the question of race in America and opened its doors to the public and said, please come hear our thoughts about the history of race in America. What they did instead was use the Drescher Center as a convening point, right? As a place where the community itself could come together, and where the folks from the Drescher Center, the scholars on campus, were there to listen, right, to the community organizers, to the school teachers, to the artists, and hear from them what the issues that they wanted on the table were, and then put together an ongoing conversation from that. So again, the key element, I think, of community engaged scholarship that really works is that first step of listening and finding out what it is the community cares about and beginning from that point.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. There's another question here from someone who says, as a climate scientist, I speak a fair bit to the public. Listening helps me write better blog posts, but I don't think that listening has ever helped me in my research. Am I doing something wrong, or is this more of a technique that is valuable for humanities? And he says some people in the public did build up sufficient expertise over time, and they now contribute. But is it just for humanities?
I don't think it's just for humanities. I think, there are fields like in the bench sciences where the methods of research are difficult to pick up, and they are what they are, right? And so, listening to other people's ideas about how you should do your experiments is probably not the way to go. On the other hand, for a climate scientist, I could very much imagine that hearing the responses to your blog posts, hearing where the points of concern in the public are, hearing where the questions that people have about climate change lie, could help you find ways to engage that public in answering together some of the questions that they need, right? Where are the fears and anxieties? Where are the points of resistance? What do people need in order to be able to believe in the work that you're doing? So I strongly suspect, though you didn't say this, that if you've been blogging actively about climate science for some time, you've gotten those kinds of responses, and they may have impacted the ways that you blog over time. Your blog posts may have evolved and shifted, and you might be reaching your audience somewhat differently. And that's a big part of what I mean by listening, is really being able to tell when you're reaching the audience and hearing what they have to say in response, and being, being in that dialogue with them.
I want to draw people's attention to a number of resources that have been added to the chat, including some by the person who posed the previous question. And I want to ask a question based on one of those posts to Kathleen. This poster says that there is an alternative open system of social media. It has a different communities who moderate themselves and talk to each other. The alternative for Twitter is the most refined, Mastodon. And this question poser has started a community on Mastodon for scholars called FEDI Science. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about the sort of alternatives to the more dominant mainstream social media platforms that scholars might want to learn more about.
Absolutely. And I have two ways that I want to talk about this. So thank you for raising this. One of them is that there are a lot of alternatives out there. I think we find ourselves kind of sucked into the main commercial alternatives because they're there and they're easy and everybody's there. So if you've got a Facebook account and there's an academic group that gets started on Facebook, it's easy because everybody's there, right? And so you can reach the people that you're trying to reach that way. The unfortunate part in that, of course, is that by feeding Facebook, by giving Facebook access to your web content, the ways that you work online, how you move, the cookies that track you, all kinds of information that it's not always clear to you that you are sharing with Facebook. We wind up in the situation that the United States is in today, right? Cambridge Analytica and its ability to manipulate electoral politics is entirely founded on Facebook. And so, I have made it a mission of mine to try to get academics to stop using those kinds of platforms that are mining your data in ways that are utterly privacy defying, but that are also mining your content in ways that you might not fully be aware of. So if you look at somebody, for instance, like academia.edu, first of all, the .edu is misleading. They are not an academic institution. They have no affiliation with the university and never have. They are a .com and should have the .com ending, but they slipped in before EDUCAUSE took control of that TLD. Anyway, academia.edu has as one of its models for profit making, which it has to do because it has to deal with its venture capital investors. One of its means of attempting to produce that profit is through mining the articles that are posted on that platform for potential research interests that can be sold to corporate entities, right? So every time we give them something for free, we're contributing to the corporate ingest of our work in ways that are really deeply undermining. So what is the alternative to this? For myself, the alternative is Humanities Commons. And there are similar not-for-profit platforms that are available for the social sciences and the sciences. In fact, we're going to be expanding into those areas as well so that we can help provide an alternative. What we need to know is that the entities that are running our ways of connecting with one another are trustworthy, that they're values-based, that they have our interests at heart, and that we believe that they will remain in that state. There have been problems, as many of you know, in recent years with that latter issue. SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, which was long used in the social sciences for preprint sharing, white paper sharing, and so forth. It was always a commercial enterprise and everybody sort of knew, but the folks behind it were academics, so it all seemed like it would all be fine. And then they sold it to Elsevier. So suddenly all of that content is now being absorbed by and controlled by a multinational publishing behemoth that has done a tremendous amount of damage to academic library budgets and to academic institution budgets. So we need to know that the platforms that we're using, that we have some control over them, that we have some governance rights in them, and that they're working for us rather than us working for them. So Mastodon is a great example because it is community controlled, and those communities can, as you say, can sort of self-regulate. Other communities like Humanities Commons work that way as well. The second thing that I want to say, and I'm going to say this as briefly as I possibly can because I'm going on, is that one of the myths of social media, and this is the next project that I want to write after I finish leading generously, is that social media, it has anything social about it at all. I mean, really the way that social media is structured, and the ways particularly that corporate social media has been structured, focuses on, hyper individualism, the need to present the self as, its sort of glowing, most polished version. And then, it reinforces these kinds of superficial connections across individuals in this way, but they produce anxiety, and they produce rage, and they produce all kinds of negative stuff for us. And so the question that I really want to focus on is, what would it be to produce a social media platform that was more rigorous in its sociality, right? That really had underneath it a rich sense of connection building and a focus on community rather than on the individual. What would that look like? It might look like something like Mastodon. It might look something like Humanities Commons. It might look like a range of other things, but it's sort of a path not traveled. And it would be really interesting to figure out what it is we need to do in order to get there.
Thank you. I think the time that we allotted for today's session is coming to a close. And although there are lots of suggestions and links in the chat, people haven't posted any additional questions. So I thought it was an opportunity to wrap up now. I want to say thank you so much to Kathleen Fitzpatrick for your generosity in making yourself available, sharing your research, particularly on a day when you may have other things to do, other distractions. I don't know what they could be, but perhaps you're busy down there south of the border. You've given us, those of us in the UBC community and many others who have signed in today, lots to think about. And maybe I'm hopeful that with your inspiration and with the opportunity that our crazy online sociality of right now during this COVID epidemic, I'm hopeful that maybe it is the time for some reinvention with guidance from scholars like yourself.
That would be
so lovely. Thank you very much to Kathleen, and thank you to everyone who attended and to co-sponsors.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen, very much. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Stay well. Bye-bye.